Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Welcome to this online symposium organized by the Getty and the University of Amsterdam. I am Leila Sauvage, a paper conservator working as a lecturer and a coordinator for the Book and Paper Conservation Program at the University of Amsterdam, and I work in the conservation science of the Rijksmuseum, also in Amsterdam. I'm joining this adventure with Edina Adam, Assistant Curator of Drawings at the Jean-Paul Getty Museum, and Michelle Sullivan, Associate Conservator of Drawings at the same museum. Early 2024, you might have seen this wonderful exhibition, Drawing on Blue, at the Getty Center. These came together with a wonderful exhibition, which I broadcast here, entitled Drawing on Blue, European Drawings on Blue Paper, 1400-1700, edited by Edina and Michel. Just to give you some details, this book contains 6 chapters, which give a lot of space to the materiality of blue paper, which I think is very new in our field. Blue paper studied in modern Europe, Italy, Spain, the Dutch Republic, and France. You can also find a lot of updates on technical and scientific examination of blue paper. Personally, this is a fantastic development of a work that I started in 2016 with a French paper mill, Moulin du Verger, which some of you might know, paper makers Jacques Bréjou and Didier Navarro, book conservator Nadine Dumas, and dyer Philippe Chazelle. And I want to thank them so much for starting this adventure that grew organically as the Blue Paper Research Consortium. And we are now able to hold annual workshops on blue paper since 2018. And we've actually came up with a blue paper reference booklet, which you might hear about. Since then, I'm extremely excited to see that there is a clear interest in blue paper as a material, now with various research groups across the world, and you will hear from some of them during this symposium. The goal of this online symposium is really to expand the scope of previous research by broadening both geographically and chronologically the scope of research, as well as making more connections across discipline. As you will probably find out throughout this symposium, blue paper is at the crossroads of many disciplines, and research can only benefit from shared expertise of paper and textile historians and conservators, as well as art historians, scientists, and others. The Getty Projects and Initiatives page will go live soon and will act for researchers as a platform for exchange. Edina, Michel, and myself are extremely excited to welcome you for these 2 days of mornings, afternoons, or evenings, depending on where you are, of lectures on blue paper. They are organized indeed over 2 days, today and tomorrow, and for each day you will have 3 sessions. Please keep in mind that the last day, the last session, will be actually a roundtable where you will see all the speakers of today and tomorrow together. But let's start today with 3 sessions. I will just name them briefly. The first one is about artistic and non-artistic use of blue paper. The second one, raw materials, trade, economics. And the third one is more about works in progress, so study, examination, collection survey on blue paper. We would like to thank all the speakers who are joining us, for accepting to share their research project, and for everyone for attending today, maybe sometimes at weird times of the day. I would like to thank the University of Amsterdam, the Conservation Training Program, as well as the Redactie department. At the Getty, we would like to thank the Drawings Department, as well as the Paper Conservation Department, and really the Public Programs Department with Greg and Aldine for helping making this possible. I will now give the word to Michelle Sullivan for some housekeeping rules, and we'll start like this. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Leila, for that wonderful introduction and providing really great background as to how we arrived here today and tomorrow with this great interdisciplinary symposium. As Leila said, just a few housekeeping remarks before we begin. We do have 3 sessions today. At the beginning of each session, a moderator will introduce all of the speakers for that session, and then the talks will proceed. At the conclusion of the final talk, we will have a 10-minute Q&A period. As attendees, you are automatically muted and your cameras are disabled, but you can submit your questions through the Q&A module. There should be a little button at the center of the lower portion of your Zoom screen. And we ask that you put your questions here rather than using the chat function. A quick note, many have asked, presentations will be recorded with just a few exceptions, and those videos will be posted to the Getty website fairly shortly following the program. All registrants who enrolled today will receive a notification via email when the recordings are available. And I think with that, I will just go ahead and introduce our first session of the day. The session is entitled Artistic and Non-Artistic Use of Blue Paper. We have two presentations in this session. The first, entitled Blue Paper in 18th Century French Paintings. This presentation is given by Lorenzo Giammattei with a co-author, Celine Secondo. Both are affiliated with La Sapienza Università di Roma. Lorenzo is currently working on his PhD and catalog raisonné of Francesco Mancini. His studies focus on graphic production in the 18th century Rome. Our second presentation today will be by Maria Zajtaruk of University of Calgary. Her presentation is entitled Seeds of Blue, Archival Evidence of the Use of Blue Paper as Seed Packets. Maria is a professor of English at the University of Calgary and curator of the department's Book Arts Laboratory. And with that, I invite Lorenzo to please join us and share his screen, and we'll begin today's session. Lorenzo?
Thank you very much. Yes. So for me, it's really a big honor to be able to open this very important symposium on the blue paper. And I would like to thank very much Leila Sauvage, Michelle Sullivan, and Edina Adam. Thanks, of course, to the Getty Museum and to University of Amsterdam for having accept our proposal. I would like to thank also to my colleague, Celine Secondo. She was really helpful and she really worked hard to make this presentation possible. And also great thanks to Simonetta Prosperi Valenti, Susanna Caviglia, and Gabriella Pace for the advice and exchanging of opinion. So, ma il più ordinatamente si suol disegnare sopra carta azzurra, così comunemente detta, o ingiallita al fumo, che dà grazioso disegnare. I will translate in English. But it is usual to draw over the so-called blue paper, or yellowed by smoke, which makes graceful drawings. With this word, Federico Zuccari, among other things, founder of the Accademia di San Luca in Rome, comments and suggests the use of blue paper to express the concept of disegno esterno, external drawing, in his treatise, published in 1607 in Turin, entitled L'idea dei pittori, scultori ed architetti, the idea of painters, sculptors, and architects. As is well known, the use of blue paper in Italy was common practice primarily in the workshop of Venetian artists, such as Tintoretto and Bassano. However, the various exchanges between academies and artists encouraged the spread of this medium, even in the workshop of Emilia and Rome. If on one end the use of blue paper was gradually spreading across Italy, the same cannot be said for France. Browsing through catalogues dedicated to the graphic works of the great French masters, examples are rare, while many drawings are on papier beige. This trend seems to change with the dawn of the Enlightenment century. In fact, from the beginning of 18th century onward, French painters also began to employ more and more cerulean paper, driven partly by the circulation of Enlightenment ideas, which regard the use of such material as a reflection of intellectual studies on light and color, as was already noted by Camilla Pietrabissa in her study on Jean-Baptiste Souteyrideau drawings. However, the use of this paper, as we will see, was mainly due to even more frequent exchanges between French and Roman academies. The use of this medium was increasingly mentioned in French artistic art literature. Noteworthy examples are Les Grands Livres de Peintre by Gérard Deleres, published in Amsterdam in 1707 and translated into French in 1787, though already known in academic circles, and Méthode pour apprendre les dessins by Charles-Antoine Jombert, published in Paris in 1755. If the first suggests the use of paper because it, and I'm quoting, it's the most pleasant and efficient manner, it is also, without doubt, the most useful and perfect, both for composing and for drawing from life, and then for serving as a basis for executing painting. And the second, after reading the Dutch text, more specifically recommend drawings academy figures on blue paper with black chalks, as the use of red chalk, red chalk can lend a manière maigre et sèche to body forms. The more widespread this material becomes at a given time and place, the more likely it is to appear in painter representation as well. Thus, it should come as no surprise to see the frequent depiction of blue paper in 18th century French works. It appears in allegories of painting, in portrayals of artist studios, and especially in painters' portraits and self-portrait, an element almost unique to their own pictorial production. To begin, we can look at the work of François Boucher, the Parisian painter who, after winning the Prix de Rome, spent over 10 years in Italy. He painted numerous allegories of painting, such as the canvas, now the National Gallery in Washington, or the little sketch in the Lille Museum. Most explanatory of all is the painting The Genius of Art at the Musée d'Angers. In this work, the arts are represented: music at the top, sculpture on the right, and architecture on the left, while two different groups appear to represent paintings. Despite the large canvas and palette with brushes, which are closely tied to painting practice, both groups of putti seem instead to center around two different drawing techniques. Sheets of blue paper abound, rolled in sketchbook. In the center, a putto is using a pen with red chalk, with a neutral white sheet paper as support, while in the bottom right, a different technique is visible. In the foreground, there is a box with various pieces of red, white, and black chalk, and a knife for sharpening them. The putto drawings hold a chalk holder, notable for accommodating two different chalk at each time. Another example is Antoine Bestier's Legacy of Art. Here, we see a young noble woman following academic practice by copying a plaster bust, likely of an ancient Roman model on blue paper. Sculptures are often present in an artist studio, either as object to practice drawing techniques or simply used as model. And we can also see the focus in these two paintings presented here by Chardin and Valérie Constant. And in both paintings, we can see that there are a lot of blue paper. In the large canvas by Jean Roux, painted in 1717, a few years after his return from an extended stay in Italy, we see Pygmalion admiring his statue. In this masterpiece of classical balance, the influences of Francesco Trevisani and Carlo Maratti emerge, especially in the figure of Pygmalion himself. In the foreground, a sketchbook stands out, prominently displaying a study on blue paper. Even more interesting is the scene in the background, where Roux, recalling his studies at the French Academy in Rome as a Grand Prix winner, includes a daily studio scene. Two young students are copying the sculpture with white chalks on vivid blue paper. The depiction of this young student focused on drawings become increasingly popular. While Roux places them in the background, in Chardin's paintings, the young students become the protagonists. The young draftsman, possibly the painter's son, elegantly dressed, hold a two-ended chalk holder with white and black chalks inserted, sharpening them with a small knife. He rests his elbow on a drawing on blue paper depicting a man's head, perhaps a copy from a model or after an ancient original. It is somehow possible to read in the lack of diligence of the young man who carelessly and recklessly leans on the dusty color, Chardin's vision little bound to the academic tradition. Indeed, only 5 drawings by Chardin are certainly known, and he was admitted to the French Academy only as a painter of fruit, flowers, and small general subjects, rejecting the traditional practice of drawing as an investigative study method. Here are all the examples of the art student. In Nicolas Bertin Lépicier, the attitude is slightly different. The elbow rests on the sheet, perhaps to avoid dirtying the sleeves or damaging the drawings underneath. Meanwhile, Boucher gives us a glimpse into the practice of a landscape drawing. The painter is indeed transferring a lakeside landscape onto the canvas. It is reasonable to think that this drawing was executed en plein air. Nicolas Flögel, the director of the French Academy in Rome, used to take the young student to draw from life in the Roman countryside, considering it an essential tool for an artistic training. Here, another example of by Pierre-Antoine Baudouin. We can again see a lot of blue paper. So, staying in Rome, it is worth to mention also the painting, or rather a snapshot of what happened in Hubert Robert's studio. The artist stayed in Rome for about a decade, from 1745 to 1764, supported by Natoire, and dedicated himself to painting ruin and landscape influenced by Panini's style. Robert depicts himself tangled in the disorder of his studio while drawing a domestic image painted with a fluid and rough brushstroke. The almost monochrome tones are enlivened by the red jacket from the chair, but especially by the blue sheet placed under the statue, the focus of the painter's attention. A completely different tone is found in Pierre Sublerat's self-portrait in his studio. The painter portrayed in Roman studio. The painter portrayed himself 3 times surrounded by his masterpiece, such as the Crucifixion of St. Peter's, the portrait of Pope Benedict XIV, and the Mass of St. Basil, which represent a journey into his career. However, we are more interested in what is hidden on the back of the painting. Another self-portrait, this time more intimate. Sublerat turned towards the viewer as if caught by surprise. He has a pencil holder in his mouth, and in background is a man's head on the canvas, while in his hand he holds a blue sheet featuring a profile of young girl. So we have seen how the representation of blue paper become increasingly frequent in 18th century French painting. Why did this happen? We all have already mentioned the cultural exchanges between French and Roman academies. In my view, the key role should be attributed to Carlo Maratti, who was trained by Andrea Sacchi, and after the death of Pietro da Cortona and Gian Lorenzo Bernini, he became the dominant figure in the Roman scene in the second half of the 17th century. The height of his career came with the appointment as perpetual prince of the Accademia di San Luca in 1706. The artist frequently used the blue paper, as we can see in these beautiful drawings, which are all over the most important museum and collection in the world. And as I said, he used a lot of the blue paper and enlivened with red chalk for his studies, but also black chalks. And as suggested by Simonetta Prosperi Valenti, this was by an aesthetic choice, and he used that particularly for nude and anatomic models. In 1664, Maratti acquired most of Francesco Raspantino collection. Francesco Raspantino is quite an unknown painter, but he was the last pupil of Domenichino, and of course, Maratti bought the inheritance of his master, Domenichino. This shows the stylistic debt that Maratti owed to the Bolognese school and its use of blue paper. The collection, indeed, contained numerous graphic works by Annibale Carracci, an artist who, more than anyone, influenced the young Maratti along with Raphael. Carracci favored blue paper for his drawings, remembering his Venetian journey. And here are some beautiful examples of the studies from the Farnese Gallery in Rome. As a good teacher, Maratti had his students work from his own drawing, as well as from the great master of the past. This is why the use of blue paper became widespread among his many pupils. I will mention Giuseppe Bartolomeo Chiari, Agostino Masucci, where we can see a beautiful studies with red chalk, and Andrea Procaccini. These are some of the most faithful epigons who carried Maratti style into the late 18th century, influencing new generation of artists. And among this new generation, Stefano Pozzi is worth mentioning, because Pozzi's graphic production is almost entirely on blue sheets. A prime example is this beautiful Apollo and Daphne from 1730, where black chalk delicately outlines the figures and landscape, while white chalk illuminates the flowing waters and the light reflection on the bodies and clothing of protagonists. Benedetto Luti is another example, Florentine by birth, but greatly influenced by Maratte's culture, particularly shaped the French figurative art with his pastels. This fruitful exchange is evident in the graphic production of the already mentioned Charles-Joseph Natoire, who personally copied his work, as well as many other Maratti students, arriving at retouching some drawings. Or how can we not mention again Pierre Subleyras, which in the Louvre collection, there are many blue sheets drawings. And Pierre Subleyras is perhaps the greatest painter in Rome in the first half of the century, who in his graphic work, as in his painting, knew how to combine better than the others the impulse coming from those Roman painters who were despised by another French, Charles-Nicolas Cauchon. So we must remember that in the cosmopolitan Rome, many Italian artists went enrolled in the French Academy at Palazzo Mancini, just as many French artists were members of the Accademia di San Luca. And a little digression, a similar point could be made for Spanish art. The aforementioned Procaccini brought much material from Maratti's studio, which became the basis of the collection of the Real Accademia di San Fernando. As noted by Maria Teresa Alvarez, Francisco Balleo production on blue paper was influenced by his time in Madrid studio of Mengs, a prominent figure of academic and theorist in the late 18th century Rome, and highly influenced by Maratti himself and his pupil. In fact, Mengs himself said that Maratti sostenne la pittura in Roma che non precipitasse come altrove. So Maratti sustained paintings in Rome so that it would not fall as it did elsewhere. So the last type of painting which the representation of blue paper appears is perhaps the most significant: portraits and self-portraits of the painters. The self-portraits represented a calling card, a demonstration of an artist's abilities. In the 18th century, it takes on additional meaning. It can, in a sense, represent a declaration of the artistic poetics. What tool do the artist surround himself with his own portrait? Above all, does the artist depict himself as a painter in general sense, perhaps with canvas, brushes, and a palette, or as a draftsman, focusing on exercise of drawing as the academic practice required? The painter, who identified with the academic ideology, often depict the tools such as two-ended pencil holder, various sheets of paper, sometimes blue, and often in the act of copying live models or statues. And so this can be said by this beautiful self-portrait by Nicolas de Largillière, where again he painted himself with a lot of blue sheets. Yes, to emphasize the importance of drawings as the fundamental basis for the art, not only painting, but artist also himself would often point out or highlight the sheets or tool in his hands. To be approved as portrait artist at the French Academy in Paris, artists were required to present 2 portraits, sometimes of other artists. These presentation works are now held mostly in the Musée National de Château de Versailles. Later, it became increasingly common for artists to donate their self-portrait to the Académie Royale, such as Arago in 1743 or Coipel in 1746, just as happens at the Accademia di San Luca. This is a form of self-celebration with the artist representing himself in the historical composition or collective portraits commissioned for him. It is also significant that painting prizes, initially only for history paintings, were expanded in 1759 to include étude de tête et de l'expression des passions, study of heads and expression of paintings. And here we can see again a portrait of Charles Natoire, a self-portrait by Hyacinthe Rigaud, or another self-portrait by Charles-Antoine Coipel, all of them, of course, holding blue sheets. A completely different example is Chardin's self-portrait, House at the Louvre. Much less grandiose and more domestic, the painter, now sick and unable to use oil, show us the same artistic support of which he is portraying himself, a sheet of blue paper mounted on canvas, on which he is drawing with pastel. The pastel is held directly in his hand without any additional tools. And here, the ideal reference for this is Rosalba Carriera, who also in 1720, during a visit to Paris, might set alongside with Benedetto Luti the mode of pastel in France. Oh, sorry. So, in conclusion, the study on the use of blue paper in drawings practices throughout the history and across different geographic areas has been carried out by observing the artifacts, historical and literary sources, and recently scientific studies. We think the study has been enriched by a visual journey presented here. We have sought to highlight the close relationship between the painters, their historical context, and their artistic production, and the representation of blue paper in their painting. And I like to conclude with Natoire drawings of two-hand holding drawing tools outlined with a delicate pencil is perhaps the best example of this war of exchanges that took place between France and Rome, based on academic practice and the multiculturalism of the institution. So I would like to thank you everyone for the attention, and now I can leave the word back to Michelle. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Maria and Lorenzo, for those really wonderful talks opening up our symposium today. Lorenzo, I'd like to ask you to join us turning on your camera, and we'll have about 10 minutes for questions from the audience for both of you. And we have some good ones. I think I'll start with one for Lorenzo. This is sort of a broader question, more asking you to kind of hypothesize a bit. Can you speak to why prior to the 18th century, the use of blue paper perhaps wasn't as widespread among French artists, even though blue paper was locally produced and imported? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, like in my opinion, like the French started to use so much the blue paper, partially because, as I said, and it's something like I was thinking about this morning, because I went to the Istituto della Grafica and I was able to talk to some restorers, and like, to me also because the blue paper was also very durable and they can bring the blue paper everywhere, like literally, because it's very, it's not that expensive. So also the French start to see how the Italian has always used the blue paper as an important material also in the bottega, in the workshop of the artist. So they start to transmit this view of the blue paper as a very useful material. I don't know if I answer your question as
Oh no, that's a great
very.
response. So maybe a little bit about the time frame, like why, even though blue paper was available in France before the 18th century, what is the delay in seeing it used so prevalently? If you have any ideas.
As I said, to me, it's all about the exchanging, actually. Like, not, I mean, I was more focused on, of course, Roman and the centric Italian, but also we have to mention Venice, of course, where they have been used the blue papers since the 16th century. So I think, as I said, like these great exchanging of visual of the art tool and everything like that. I think that in the 18th century, and of course, as I said, it's the century of enlightenment. So also they see that also the blue paper is very useful to create determinate shadow and light effects. So I think there is a combination of reasons why in the French they start also to use, but as I said, we can say like the same for Spain. It's almost the same. And yes, because mostly like we know, as I said, Italy or the Netherlands, but I mean, as much as they started to use that, they see how value is to use the blue paper.
Great, thank you. Our next one's for Maria, and this one sort of compiles a few different people's questions, all on the same theme. So we often hear about pest repellent or protective qualities of blue paper, and it's known that some dyes used in blue paper making, particularly woad and indigo, have antibacterial properties. Woad in particular is known to have been used in France for this reason. Have you come across any written sources in the 18th century that talk about these properties, why paper makers might use it to use for papers for wrapping, for example?
Sorry, what was the last? I just missed the last couple of words.
Sure. Have you come across any written sources dating to like the 18th century that specifically speak to these antibacterial or pest repellent properties that might make this paper more desirable for wrapping?
For wrapping. Yeah, I mean, I haven't come across really any sources yet that talk. You get a lot of discussion of sort of how to dry herbarium specimens, but much less discussion of how to wrap seeds, except, don't wrap them and add so much bulk that it's going to cost more when the letter arrives. You sort of get discussions in Peter Collinson's correspondence. Of that, you do have some discussion of reusing letters. So I told my gardener, to save our old letters and use those to wrap seeds. So, but I haven't come across anything. And I mean, in this talk, I certainly haven't meant to suggest that there was an intentionality for using blue paper, more just that it is one of the kinds of papers that was used. And in the background are many brown wrapper. You see a lot of brown, like strictly what we'd say brown wrapping paper, no watermarks, a thicker coarse paper used, more often than you would see blue paper used. So I don't have any printed sources yet to say that there was. In fact, it seems to me, just in the limited examples that I have, that blue paper, and maybe this is just it's a part of the chemical reaction of indigo to iron, but is actually more stained than white or brown paper when it's wrapping plant material. And I don't know the reason for that, but it actually
Yeah, that was
doesn't.
another question.
Yeah.
Yeah, the rust-proof properties. Okay, so
Yeah,
no
for
clear.
needles, and that was a lighter kind of blue paper, and when it comes to plants, I've just noticed this pattern, and that's why I want to show the example of the wove paper, that it's quite stained.
Great, yeah, and just to include on the needle paper, did you find any sources in particular talking about why that paper was marketed as rust-proof for the needles, or is it just
Irene
marketing?
Ruckel talks a bit about that kind of paper in her article, so
Okay.
that's really where that reference
Great.
comes from.
Okay, we have one more before break, I think, for Lorenzo. So you talked a bit about the use of blue paper in a teaching setting, particularly when you're speaking about Marathi and Karachi. Do you think there is any particular purpose that blue paper served beyond emulation of the master? Any reason that they were drawn to blue paper for teaching? Oh, you're muted, Lorenzo. Sorry.
Sorry. And yeah, absolutely. Like, as I said, like the blue paper is it's a little bit rough, but also very durable. Like it's very hard to consume it. So I think that medium was chosen in the workshop for that. Like if we excluding the aesthetical reason, also there was like a very handy reason, like the masters also, when maybe they have to go to fresco to paint some fresco somewhere, they can bring with them the blue paper, because it was really hard to ruin it. So I think like this exchanging of blue paper from the master to the pupil helped the diffusion in the workshop. So it's something like, I was watching this morning the drawings by Gimignani, Ludovico, and Giacinto, and they use a lot of blue paper, and weirdly enough, there were a lot of stain on the piece of paper, meaning that they were exchanging. Maybe they bring in where they made some fresco. So I think that's mainly that, because it's very durable and very useful also beside the walls of the workshop.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both for your presentations and for fielding these questions. To our audience, if we didn't make it to your question, don't worry, we will circle back to some of these themes probably in our roundtable discussion tomorrow, so there'll be another chance. Also, I just wanted to mention we had a few sort of broader questions about paper making and paper properties. We're going to post a couple of links in the chat box during the break that might help with terminology and questions like that in particular. Okay, everyone, thank you for your attention. We will be taking a break now, 15 minutes, returning at 10:15 prompt for our second session of the morning. Thank you, everyone.
Welcome back. My name is Adina Adam, and I'm one of the co-organizers of today's symposium on blue paper. The second session is entitled Raw Materials, Trade and Economics, and we have two presenters, Judith Norman, who is an associate professor of early modern art history at the University of Amsterdam, where she has taught multiple courses on old master drawings. Professor Norman, in 2016, she organized an exhibition at the Rembrandt House Museum in Amsterdam called Rembrandt's Naked Truth, which included Dutch nude model drawings on blue paper, and she has an upcoming article on Dutch blue paper. Our second speaker is Megan Baker, who is a doctoral candidate in art history at the University of Delaware, where she's writing a dissertation entitled Crayon Rebellion, The Material Politics of North American Pastels from 1758 to 1812. She's currently a Smithsonian Institution predoctoral fellow at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and National Portrait Gallery. And with that, I will hand it over to Professor Norman.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you to the organizers for putting together this outstanding program on blue paper. As we dive with this program deeper into the world of blue paper, which a couple of hours ago may have seemed like quite a simple notion, I would like to discuss Dutch blue paper, or even more specifically, Dutch logwood paper. In the 17th century Dutch Republic, it would have been the only paper that one could buy readily made, and that would have been colored through and through. So any other color paper would be painted for the purpose of it, or washed, as one would say. Most common paper was actually white or off-white, gray or brown, as one might see in this composition painted by the Antwerp-born artist Cornelis Norbertus Gijsbrecht. And there is, of course, that one striking sheet of blue paper. This, of course, is a painted composition, so whether or not this was logwood paper is impossible for me to discern. But these 18th century samples demonstrate that Dutch blue logwood paper was available in a variety of shades of blue and qualities. So I initially became interested in Dutch blue paper because of its artistic use, but I came to appreciate over time the global view it offers on the Dutch Republic. After all, the story of Dutch blue paper sort of moves through the early modern world. In a nutshell, the story started in Central and South America, where the raw materials were harvested, and it would journey across the Atlantic, passing through an Amsterdam penitentiary institution, as I will discuss, and it ended up in the paper mills in the Dutch Zaanstreek. Once sold as a final product, Dutch blue paper was also used to wrap sugar, as we've already heard, but also to print political pamphlets and to make drawings. But whether or not it was used for seed packaging, that I don't know, but I'm fascinated to learn more. So with its sort of surprising twists and turns, the history of Dutch blue paper was fascinating to me. It strings together all of these stories, both about innovation and entrepreneurialism on the one hand, but also deep-rooted inequality and rampant abuse of power on the other. So for my paper today, I will be applying Arjan Apaterai's concept of the social life of things to sort of reconstruct the life of this Dutch logwood paper, to sort of commemorate its stages, to deepen our understanding of what would become, amongst others, artist materials. So I've broken it down into three sections. Two I will emphasize, which is the origin and then that sort of history or life of Dutch blue paper. And I'll note briefly some things about the artistic exploration. But first, its origin. So we've already in the comments seen a few questions about what makes blue paper sturdy. Well, Dutch logwood paper is a little bit different because of the dye stuff that was used. Blue paper had been around before the 17th century, the period on which I'm focusing, and actually since the 14th century it was available, but most often the dye stuff would be something other than logwood. It would be often indigo, and we've already heard some other examples. So Dutch logwood paper owed its color to a dye stuff obtained from the heartwood of a tree called the Hematoxylon campechianum, which is native to Central and South America. These kinds of trees, and you see some pictures here, they grow 9 to 15 meters tall. They have sort of these short, crooked trunks, and the leaves are these sort of beautiful feather heart shapes, these oval leaflets. The wood itself is extremely dense and heavy and hard, and the wood, as you can see on this tree trunk, is actually not blue but red. But when the wood chips are moistened with about 30% water, the hematoxylin changes into a coloring matter called hematine, which actually is blue. So to ask what's in a name, the popular name of the Hematoxylon campechianum is logwood in English. In Dutch 17th century sources, however, logwood is referred to as blauwhout or Campechehout or even Brazilhout, which is kind of a misnomer because that's also an umbrella term for lots of different kinds of wood, just to keep things simple. But when the Dutch began to make blue paper, they used this logwood, and it became a highly commercially competitive commodity. Not in the least because with this added wood, the blue paper was slightly sturdier than other kinds of paper, although there are thicker kinds of blue paper made without logwood as well. So this history or this life of Dutch blue paper that interests me can be traced through 3 production stages. One took place in the Atlantic trade in logwood. A second locale would be this penitentiary system in Amsterdam. And the third location or stage in the life and production of logwood paper would be the paper mills on the Dutch River Zaan. The life of Dutch paper very much began in Central America and is therefore rooted in Dutch colonial history. Here, the Dutch conquered and governed a political and military unit, which was known at the time as Dutch Brazil. It was a short-lived history, roughly datable to the second quarter of the 17th century. But even before this Dutch Brazil, the Dutch and others, this Spanish, Portuguese, were trading and shipping Brazil wood, including this logwood. It was really quite a business, and lots of money was made. In the years 1667, 1668, for instance, the Dutch imported 1.5 million pounds of Brazil wood at a value of over 500,000 guilders. A portion of this would have been logwood, but it's almost impossible to discern just how much of it. Because of the problem with the sources and the sort of irregularity in calling things specifically Brazil wood or logwood. But as you can see, the top blue arrow shows the Brazil wood, but sugar was much higher in value, but certainly not in mass. So once harvested and brought aboard these Dutch trading ships, logwood was carried across the Atlantic. In Amsterdam, the wood was brought to these to a very specific workhouse. This is the second stage in the life of Dutch blue paper, one could say. The space or place was known at the time as the Rasphuis, as you can see in the print on the left. The Rasphuis simply means saw house because the prisoners who were staying there were forced to saw or grate wood, including logwood, into dust and wood chips. And the building is no longer there, but the entrance that you can see on the print on the left in the lower right corner is also visible in the picture on the right, which is now an entrance to a shopping mall. So in these 2 prints, we see 2 prisoners operating a 7-bladed saw to grate this kind of tree trunk. And on the print on the right, in the back of this courtyard, you see these tree trunks sort of stacked in the corner of this inner courtyard. So the Amsterdam Rasphuis or saw house was a novelty in early modern European justice system, because it was the first reformatory on the continent. Previously, criminal punishment had only consisted of corporal and capital punishment, banishment, and galley slavery. Imprisonment in and of itself was new, and it was idealistically intended as an alternative, more humane punishment, which aimed very much at rehabilitation and at returning prisoners to society as responsible, upstanding citizens. But as things go, soon after the Rasphuis opened its doors at the end of the 16th century, the project fell short of its idealism. Already in 1599, the Rasphuis obtained a monopoly on grating dye woods, which meant that nobody in or outside the city walls was allowed to grate Brazil wood or even use Brazil wood dust unless it came from the Rasphuis. The reformatory became hugely profitable and equally morally bankrupt. It was a money-making machine with prisoners being forced to meet quota and work 14-hour days, and they were operating these incredibly heavy saws, one of which survives, albeit from a different penitentiary. The work, as it was known, was relentless, back-breaking, and harrowing. But it did produce that dye stuff, which would, at the Raspaus, be put in barrels. Water was added, which was, of course, done to turn the hematoxylin into hematine, producing this blue dye stuff. The barrels were consequently brought to, amongst others, nearby paper mills. And these paper mills are the third locale of the life of Dutch logwood paper. Specifically, there's a group, or was a group, of paper windmills along the Dutch River Zaam. And they were a relatively new industry, because in the 16th century, the Dutch didn't need to really produce their own blue paper because they imported it from Italy through the harbor of Antwerp. But that harbor was closed as a result of the 80 Years' War. And the resulting paper shortage in the Dutch Republic prompted the Dutch to start producing paper themselves, including blue paper. So by the end of the 17th century, about 60 paper windmills were located on the Dutch River Zaam. They have all disappeared except for one, and that's the one you're looking at right now, which is called the Schoolmeester, the schoolmaster. It's built in 1692. It's been beautifully restored. And this is actually the sole surviving wind-operated paper mill in the world. So the miller who operated still produces blue paper, although it's no longer done with logwood, but with blue jeans. So that's a bit different, but otherwise the paper making process, shredding the fabric, scooping the paper paste, pressing paper, and drying individual sheets, as you can see here in these contemporary sources, is still being done today. And they give workshops and everything, so I highly recommend a visit. So the local people who worked at these so-called blue and gray paper mills, they kept the production processes secret, including its use of logwood as a dye stuff. And the story goes that this secret was kept for several centuries. And to me, this is easily imaginable, if only because the history of logwood is so unusual and surprising in several ways. With a transatlantic pedigree and roots in a new penal system, its secret, the logwood dye, I think would have been almost impossible to guess. So these are the sort of the three stages that I've been discussing. And then, of course, thanks to that added wood, Dutch blue paper was actually stronger than most white paper, although these are very generalizing remarks, and I think fine-tuning them would be part of the next stages of the research that we're all doing. It was unique in several ways, in its color, but also in its sturdiness, and perhaps even in its price, although I've yet to find proper sources on this. I don't know of any paper shops or lists of paper, at least not in the Dutch Republic. But supposedly unique in these ways, it was used for very specific purposes. And I have two pictures of those sugar loaves here for you. And in this case, we actually do know that there was a reason, because the blue would have given off like a slight hue that made the white of the sugar seem whiter and thus pure and of higher quality, more expensive, etc. But also Dutch artists used blue paper. Based on the studio scenes, I have a couple of them as well, but these are, of course, of Dutch artists. Blue paper was clearly around in these studios. And I think in some cases, they inspired artists to do and try something different. And I have two sort of examples for you to sort of illustrate this point. And the first example is Hendrik Holtzius, an Haarlem artist who made an innovative series of landscape. In these series, each composition is printed in different ways using different techniques. So on the left, for instance, we are looking at a chiaroscuro woodcut, which is printed with color blocks on white paper, which then provides the highlights. While on the right, we have the same composition, but on blue paper, and this is done using a line block impression, and then the white heightening that you see. So on the side of that sort of meal, you can see those white lines, and those are actually hand painted. So in this series, and it's every time it's a different composition, the artist replicates the composition, but uses the color of the paper to a different effect. So with the white paper, the white is actually the highlight, whereas with the blue, it's sort of the middle tone, if you will. The second example of the sort of artistic exploration of what this blue could do concerns a group of artists who were working in Amsterdam around the 1650s. This group, for the first time, hired women who would pose nude for them. And this, again, is a novelty in Western art. And to draw them, these artists were, again, using two different kinds of materials and techniques, either red, black, and white chalk on white paper, or blue paper with black and white chalk. And some of the art theorists of this group later wrote down why this was. It was sort of an exercise, because the trick was to really use, again, that blue color as a middle ground. And they were trying, or sort of challenging themselves, not to have the black and the white chalk touch anywhere. So that's an interesting thing to sort of search for when you're looking at these new models. So in both of these examples, with Goltzius and with the Amsterdam artists, the artists are visibly experimenting with innovative practices and then allowing viewers to compare and contrast the sort of materials and techniques that they're using. So in conclusion, I have two sort of observations for you. Dutch logwood paper, I think, offers an almost kaleidoscopic view of the Dutch Republic in connection and connects it with ongoing discussions about global trade, colonization, and inclusive histories. A deeper understanding of sort of the prehistory of Dutch logwood paper as a manufactured material also shows how invention and innovation went hand in hand with oppression and equality. And on a methodological level, I think such object-based interdisciplinary research, which it really is, also prompts new research questions, usually where the two disciplines do not quite touch. For instance, where exactly were the Dutch harvesting this logwood, and who profited exactly from the sawhouse monopoly, and how much money was made exactly? So none of these questions are at the core of any one discipline. They sort of fall in between. And my second observation concerns the identification of different kinds of blue paper, which I think is important to the story of logwood paper, but it can also allow insight into why artists were increasingly using blue paper here or there. And the problem with Dutch blue paper, at least, is that we can't really always identify whether it's logwood paper, because some of the watermarks are misleading. And they're misleading because Dutch paper mills are known, or at least the mills that were producing blue and gray paper, were in the habit of purchasing second-hand decks to make these kinds of papers. So the watermark doesn't actually belong to the paper mill that's producing the blue paper. They come from elsewhere. They're simply recycled, if you will. Now, we do know that technical analysis is able to identify logwood, as demonstrated by Claude Coupry, Alain Lautier, and Roy Perkinson in a wonderful article in Techne. But such research has barely been done and rarely applied to Dutch blue paper. And of course, I'm very much in favor of studying that, so we may begin to appreciate the changing availability of Dutch logwood and other kinds of blue paper. So in closing, I'm very glad that scholars such as Leila Sauvage and Aaron Wrightson, but also Alexa McCarthy and others, are now studying Dutch 17th century logwood paper from various perspectives, including conservation, colonial history, and art history. So I'm very happy that the study of Dutch blue paper has clearly only just begun. So I would like to thank you all for listening. If you want to know more specifically about this paper, I do have a publication on it coming out. And of course, I use that wonderful composition for the cover. It's in an edited volume I did with Feike Dietz. And for those of you interested in learning more, I did include 2 slides. If you want to take a screenshot, you're more than welcome to. That's why I included these slides. So this is the one, and then I have a second one as well. So that's really, if you want to know much more about Dutch logwood paper. And with that, I end and I pass the mic on to the wonderful Megan Baker.
Thank you so much, Judith. That was absolutely wonderful. And I think that my paper takes off on some of those questions as well and leads us to some new ones. I just want to start by thanking the organizers for the opportunity to present, and to all of you wonderful attendees for being so interested in learning more about blue paper today. In February 1777, the pastelist Benjamin Blythe billed Hannah Thomas for a portrait of her late husband, John, a major general who had died the previous year from smallpox in Quebec while fighting in the American Revolution. The fragile portrait, made by applying chalky pigments directly to white laid paper already mounted on a wooden board, has not survived well. Pigments have shifted and scattered, with smears of blue flecking across his face. Mildew damage appears along the left edge, and the wooden backing has splintered from centuries of exposure to humidity, reflecting both the technical challenges and material constraints of early American pastel production. The shifts of blue pigment are a consequence of Blythe's technique. He applied blue crayon to plain white paper to mimic blue paper, the preferred support for pastel drawing and painting. The portrait highlights the volatility of the medium. The delicate pastel was prone to scatter and decay, making enemies of both time and transport. Yet the medium thrived in early America. Why did artists seek out such a volatile medium during the age of Atlantic revolutions? How did pastel's components journey from quarry to paper during a time of warfare and embargo? Artistic materials, including pigments, chalk, binders, and paper, connected early American artists to transatlantic supply networks, imperial labor, and revolutionary politics. These material histories reveal how the conditions of wartime shaped artistic practice throughout the American Revolution and into the early national era. Pastel's production and use reflect a broader struggle for autonomy amid shifting politics. As a delicate, ephemeral, and yet highly extractive medium, propped up aesthetic systems of white supremacy. As supply chains became disrupted, artists like Benjamin Blythe improvised with local substitutes, revealing how their work was entangled in larger colonial systems of labor and resource extraction. Pastel, or crayon, rose in prominence as an independent medium during the first half of the 18th century, finding devotees in both France and England, as well as a notable coterie of critics. By the mid-1750s, English artists were largely dissuaded from working in the pastel, owing to its close association with the British imperial rival, the French, as well as its delicate and damage-prone nature. Future president of the British Royal Academy, Sir Joshua Reynolds, dismissed the medium as, quote, just what ladies do for amusement, while his own oil technique led Horace Walpole to remark that, quote, his colors seldom stand longer than crayons. The difficulty of fixing pastels to paper meant immediate framing behind glass was essential to preserve artworks. In the 18th century, as now, it can be difficult and dangerous to move them. Many remain off view on racks in museum basements, and it's all but impossible to stage exhibitions of pastels. Despite these challenges, it gained popularity in North America around 1760. John Singleton Copley thought his, quote, best portraits done in this way. Owing to its relatively quick execution time and affordability, the medium became an important method for depicting individuals and even ideas. Though thousands of pastel images were made by artists across continental North America and the Caribbean from the late 1750s through the early 19th century, their low survival rate has contributed to an underreporting of its historical significance in the Americas. Salem, Massachusetts, a vibrant port just 11 miles from Boston, was a notable hub for pastel work. Benjamin Blythe was born and raised there, belonging to a French-speaking artisan family from the Isle of Jersey, which had migrated to the region in the mid-17th century, seeking economic opportunities rather than religious freedom. By age 20, Blythe was producing notable works, including a pendant pair of portraits representing the newlywed John and Abigail Adams. His steady, competent application of crayon to paper suggests years of practice, likely supported by his artisan upbringing. In the year Blythe completed the Adams portraits, 1766, a series of events commenced, making it more difficult for him to access the materials necessary for his profession. While merchants had imported artistic supplies to North America from the 1730s onward, the ready availability of these supplies shifted during the late 1760s as the British government began to enact and enforce taxes on various goods in the British North American colonies to help sustain their growing empire. Most notable of these was the Revenue Act of 1767, which enacted a tax on many everyday goods, including glass, painter's colors, and 58 different types of paper, including every single ream of blue paper. The British Americans responded with non-importation agreements, publicly shaming merchants who did not participate in the embargo, and a homespun movement developed that continued as discontent over questions of taxation and representation grew. Though some merchants, particularly those with large warehouses, had enough backstock of some materials to continue selling them to interested parties, many others were simply unable to meet the demands for routine goods that had previously been possible. Art-making supplies remained in short stock during the American War, when British blockading of ships led to critical shortages of many imported materials, forcing artists to improvise. Blythe was lucky, as his family's involvement in art production extended beyond his portrait practice. His father was a sailmaker, and his brother Samuel opened a shop in 1771, which sold painting utensils, painter's colors, and watercolor palettes made inside seashells, which were likely made in-house. Samuel also carved the frames that enclosed his brother's pastel portraits and began to take portraits after Benjamin was forced to leave town in 1782. Samuel's close relationship with the Boston art supplier John Gore and Benjamin's extensive patronage from local merchants suggests the brothers had access to imported prefabricated and raw materials when available, but they also had the resources to make their own supplies. Robert Dossey's treatise, The Handmaid to the Arts, which was available at the Salem Social Library, provided guidance for making pastels, though the process required trial and error. 18th century pastels consist of a pigment, an extender or a filler, and a binding agent. Manuals like Dossey's provided a loose set of instructions, suggesting which binders worked best with specific pigments. But because pigments have unique material characteristics, they form differently depending on the binding substance and quantity of solution used. Suggested binding agents included food and food byproducts like milk, whey, alewort, sugar candy, as well as more traditional artistic supplies like linseed oil, gum arabic, and gum tragacanth. Some pigments respond best to specific binders and fillers and form poor marking implements if produced otherwise. Resulting crayons can be too hard, leaving no mark, or too brittle, breaking upon even the slightest amount of pressure. While plaster of Paris was sometimes used as a filler, other materials were preferred, notably pipe clay, and chalk. Chalk, however, took many forms. The entry for chalk in the Encyclopédie lists 8 different forms of the material, each recognized for different properties and tonalities. Natural calcite white chalk is the best form for pastels, with its fine texture making it suitable for mixing with pigment. The lack of chalk along the east coast of North America presented a challenge to European colonists arriving from some of the most chalk-dense regions on Earth. Chalk can be turned into lime, with architectural applications in mortar, plaster, and whitewash. Anglo-American settlers did not encounter domestic chalk deposits or establish a chalk quarry until 1796. Instead, they used shells, burning them to produce a substitute material while also importing chalk from Europe. This material was almost always called French chalk, suggesting an origin from the chalk deposits in the Champagne region, where chalk mines operated from the 4th century AD through the French Revolution. Determining whose labor was operative in the extraction of the material and tracing where it actually came from have been difficult, making it challenging to ascertain whose health was put at risk to provide this dusty artistic supply, but someone's certainly was. Coercive and exploitative labor practices were also deployed in the making of paper. Paper became a critically important commodity both before and during the American Revolution. In fact, paper producers in several states were given exemptions from serving in the militia because their labor was required at mills, providing the fledgling nation with a supply of this necessary material. As John Garcia's ongoing research demonstrates, both free and enslaved African Americans were paper makers during the American Revolution. Blue paper, which was often called sugar paper because of its alternate use as a wrapping material for sugar cubes, was among the types of paper being produced. Blue paper could even be made entirely of domestic materials, as the indigo which provided its tone was produced on plantations in the Carolinas. In this way, both the crop providing the paper's color, as well as the primary use as sugar paper, were reliant on plantation-based slavery and other exploitative labor practices. One reason for blue paper's use in both realms was based upon promoting whiteness. The tone provided contrast to emphasize white skin, with the paper that enfolded sugar cones participating in the same optical program. As 18th century Americans took up the cause of liberty, writers cheered on local production and sourcing. An anonymous author, likely Samuel Adams, chronicled the ways individuals contended with the injustice of the Revenue Acts during 1769. He noted the duties on paper, quote, served as a bounty to encourage our paper manufacturers, as people now carefully saved rags from the fire and dunghill, so that they would soon have, quote, as little occasion to import that manufacture. He then wrote that the, quote, tax upon painters' colors has set a whole continent to explore their hills and mountains, in consequence of which we have now discovered and now actually made use of a red and yellow ochre, superior in quality to what was imported from England. The liberty-minded colonists likewise extracted their own oil from flaxseed in quantities allegedly large enough to export, and would soon be capable of producing, quote, a full supply of the white lead so necessary for the painters in America, owing to the discovery of a mine near Boston. The Blythe brothers had access to all of the materials necessary to fabricate pastels. Given Samuel's business and Benjamin's extensive portraiture career, it seems likely that they made their own crayons, if only occasionally, when boycotts and warfare interrupted the ready availability of pre-made European art supplies. Following the patriotic cause, they may have used locally sourced ochres and lampblack from fireplace charcoal, or perhaps they relied on backstock of imported pigment. Well, depending upon artistic treatises, they almost certainly had to experiment to determine their own recipes for a successful crayon, one that made marks in a manner that suited their artistic needs. The resulting pastels were more difficult to work with and less forgiving than imported crayons, resulting in material complications and increased conservation issues. But artists making them participated in a revolutionary act. These materials tangibly substantiated the reasons for the British Empire's rupture. Americans could locally produce many of the materials subjected to excessive taxation, using homespun goods to subvert traditional importation routes as a form of nation building. These experiments yielded crayons with unpredictable textures, affecting the visual quality and conservation of resulting artworks. For instance, the surface texture of Blythe's Mrs. Lydia Phippen Fiske is unusually three-dimensional, appearing simultaneously cakey and waxy. The portrait, which was made around 1770, may have been made with preliminary crayons. The portrait of Thomas Mason shows a very different texture. An opaque velvety chalkiness distinguishes his blue jacket, in contrast to less lush black marks through which paper remains visible. The whites of the shirt and collar have attracted fugitive color particles from elsewhere in the portrait, while also becoming muddied in tone, perhaps from the inclusion of a color-shifting pigment or from mildew. Pastel portraits from the early 1780s, like that of Jean Guibout, have a similar appearance to those made over 15 years earlier, even though the texture of the crayons used seems to differ. So though imported crayons may have become available again at certain points in time, Blythe could have become proficient with locally produced alternatives, making reliance on imported goods less necessary, one of the ultimate goals of the patriotic cause. Making one's own artistic materials, particularly pastels, necessitated multiple forms of risk, both to one's finances and health. Some of the pigments that Dossie's text recommends are incredibly toxic. These pigments had to be reduced to a very fine powder by grinding them on a stone, making them airborne. Chalk, too, had to be reduced from a solid state back into the powders of shells, undoing the geological time of calcareous formations so that the material could become dust-like. Once emulsified with a binder, the pigmented chalky paste must be shaped by hand into individual crayons, covering the maker's hands and sometimes staining them for days. Inhaling particles and absorbing toxins through the skin was dangerous to both individuals who mined the pigments, as well as those fabricating art supplies with them. Individuals enslaved by artists often ground paint and performed other preparatory tasks in the artist's studio in colonial America, making them even more susceptible to these damaging effects and raising questions about other unseen ways that art making contributed to anti-Black violence. The extractive nature of the homespun movement encouraged settlers to further exploit the North American countryside to maintain a sense of consumer normalcy during political rebellion, harming the environment and ultimately people in the name of patriotism. The hazardous process involved in pastel production reveals not only the physical risks faced by artists, but also the broader social and environmental costs. However, the material and ideological implications of pastel extend far beyond the studio. Embedded within colonial systems, pastel became loaded with political symbolism as a medium with which to depict soldiers and patriots. The story of pastel in early America is one of both innovation and exploitation. The medium embodies the resourceful adaptation necessary at a time of war, as well as the extractive ideological underpinnings of North American settler colonialism. The materials used in pastel artworks were embedded in systems of environmental and social exploitation. Yet these same materials also symbolized resistance, as colonial British Americans sought to break free from British imperial control by producing their own goods and country, reflecting the values and complexities of a new nation in formation. Pastel's soft, luminous surfaces obscured the harsh realities of its production, masking the labor, extraction, and colonial violence embedded in its materials. Much like the genteel portraits it was used to create, conceal the upheaval of the revolutionary moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentations, both of which very successfully place blue paper in a global context. We have a number of questions, and I'll begin with a few addressed to Judith. So first of all, could you please talk a little bit about the types of documents that you have come across in course of your research, primary sources?
Thank you for that question. So because it's an interdisciplinary sort of study that goes through all of these stages, they're different. So when it comes to the artistic use of the paper, there are several artists who wrote about it. So Karel van Mander, Samuel van Hoogstraat, and Geert de la Resse, they all speak about the use of blue paper. When it comes to the 17th century paper making process, it's actually not laid down anywhere, which is interesting in and of its own, but that certainly hampers the research. So what I'm basing this on often is early 18th century descriptions. And then an added source are archival documents of people trading paper, which is difficult because it's not always described as you'd like it to be. So the word logwood isn't often used. And then, of course, there are the trading books of the Dutch trading companies, the overseas trading companies, the VOC, but in this case, the WIC. And again, there the problem is that they use the word Brazil wood for everything. So it's very difficult to sort of get to the heart of things. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Related to this, logwood is known to dye in different colors depending on its pH. Do written sources explain if paper makers were playing with this property?
Wouldn't that be nice? But no, but I think they were playing around with it. So when you see a paper mill like this operating, they often just put things in and see how it's not difficult to do. It's not difficult to get out of the machines. So I imagine it was a sort of a trial and error. I mean, these days they do like festive things. They throw in all kinds of stuff just to create like different kinds of decorative papers. They have hundreds of different kinds, which is really interesting. But it really shows to me that this is not something you conceive on paper. You develop it in the actual space, and then you keep it a secret as best you can once you hit the gold mine. Yeah.
And why do you think the Dutch paper makers opted for the use of logwood over other colorants?
Well, I think it was it made it bluer in a way. So it was the usual procedure with the cloth and the rags, but then the logwood paste would be added to it. And I think it must have been cheap, but I've found no proof of that. For that, I would need documents giving values of logwood, but also wood and other ingredients. I would need to know how much they were adding, how much it cost to process it properly. But I do think logwood might have been cheaper because the processing, of course, was practically free because of the labor done in the workhouses. It certainly made things more profitable, I would imagine.
Thank you so much. A question to Megan. Could you talk a little bit about blue paper production in North America before or after the Revolution?
Yeah, I would be happy to. So most of my information comes from John Bidwell's survey of American paper mills. And my understanding is that there's not continual production of blue paper in North America before the Revolution. But then once the Revolution starts, there is sort of continuous production of blue paper from that point onward. Paper making in North America up until the Revolution is a super hit or miss industry. There are a lot of attempts to get it going and a lot of mills that sort of get started and then falter after a short period of time. And so there's not as much sort of continuity or, in fact, need to make it a domestic market until the Revolution sort of disrupts this availability of global paper in a more profound way. But at that moment, it becomes really important to have paper as you're sort of trying to print documents and create a new nation and still maintain communication with other European powers. Paper was a critical commodity, which I think hasn't been talked about enough, right? It's sort of something that we're taught in American elementary school is like, this is a really big deal about the American Revolution. But as I've been sort of working on this material, I would love to see more people talking about it.
And do you happen to know if there were mills specialized in blue paper manufacture?
In blue paper specifically?
Yes, specifically.
I have not. Well, so I have a couple mills that are talking about how they're making blue paper in addition to other things, but they're not exclusively making blue paper. They're making blue paper and white paper and yeah.
And the next one is not so much a question, but one of our audience members found it interesting that Benjamin Blythe created prepared blue paper for pastel drawings using pastel rather than a wet medium. Do you have any idea why he might have done that?
I think he didn't know what he was doing, and he was doing it best. Like this is most of the artists that I'm working on are supremely self-taught, and they're really doing their best to sort of use the materials in a way that seems noteworthy and reasonable to them. And so he knows he's supposed to be using blue paper, and he's used it at moments previous. Those weird portraits of the atoms are on a toned paper. They're painted at the same time, and one paper is absolutely greener than the other, but that's just the way that the papers that he was using were. And so I think that he's very okay with the fact that things do not look like they look in Europe because he has no reference point for that.
Okay, thank you. And one more question for Judith. You mentioned in your talk that by adding logwood to the paper became sturdier and stronger than white paper. Could you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, so some of the Dutch blue paper, when you put it on a light bed, you can't even see if there's a watermark. It's that thick. But not all of the blue paper is like that. So it, again, very much depends on, I think, the batch even. So today they make this sort of, in the paper mill, the Schoolmeester, the one that I mentioned, they make bord, which is almost between cardboard and paper. So you can really go into different sort of thicknesses, but you can do that with white paper as well. So I would say on average, logwood paper might be slightly thicker than other blue paper, but then other blue paper might be on average thicker than white paper, which isn't to say that there isn't white paper that's thicker than logwood paper.
Yes, I think it's important to emphasize that blue paper, just like white paper, was manufactured in different qualities and
very different qualities. Yes.
Yes, and it seems to Megan's reference to that one source that mentions 58 different types of paper seems to confirm that we kind of like oversimplify our understanding of paper in the 18th century in a way. Okay, are there any more questions? There's one more. This is quite technical, but do you know the percentage of logwood made paper versus those colored with blue or colored blue with indigo and woad, Judith?
No, I don't. We don't have production lists, quotas. We don't even have of a single paper shop an inventory that includes logwood paper. But when it comes to Dutch drawings on blue paper, we don't even know which ones are done on logwood paper because we haven't identified them. So there are literally no sources to come up with a comparison like this. I love all of the questions in the chat. They are my questions as well. But the sources really aren't there. And I imagine, Megan, with you, it's very similar. It'd be great to get that kind of documentation, but we really don't know. One way to know is, as I mentioned, is to do the technical research. I think that might be an indicator.
Thank you so much. We're going to take a short break and resume at 11:05. No, we'll return at 11:20. I'm sorry about that. Thank you so much. And we'll see you soon.
Welcome back, everyone, for the last session of today. I will be sharing the last session. We have 3 talks to finish, and I will introduce the 3 main speakers, and we will start with the talks. So first, Elizabeth Gralton is a graduate of the University of Melbourne's Master of Cultural Materials Conservation. She's currently the Sherman Fairchild Foundation Postgraduate Fellow in Paper Conservation at the Morgan Library and Museum in New York City. She will then be followed by Maya C. Donnelly, who is the current Samuel Kress Fellow in Paper Conservation at the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto, Canada. She holds a Master in Art Conservation from Queen's University, a Bachelor of Fine Art from Concordia University, and has a professional experience as a papermaker and bookbinder. The last talk will be given by Charlotte Park, who completed a BA in Art History from Victoria University in New Zealand before undertaking an MA in Cultural Material Conservation at the University of Melbourne in Australia. Since graduating in 2006, Charlotte has worked in both public and private conservation studios in Australia and in the UK. She has now been working at the National Galleries of Scotland in Edinburgh for 14 years across the diverse international collection. I will invite first Elizabeth to join me, turn on your camera, and I will leave you the words.
Thanks, Layla, for that introduction. I'd like to start by acknowledging that while this particular presentation is primarily the work of the Morgans paper conservators, so Reba Snyder, Becca Pollock, and myself, Paper Conservation Fellow, the broader project of surveying the Morgans collection of works on blue paper has involved contributions from the rest of the conservation team, as well as other staff at the Morgan, who I would like to thank for their input and support. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Morgan Library and Museum in New York City, it began its life as the personal collection of financier J. Pierpont Morgan, who began at the end of the 19th century to develop a significant collection of illuminated and historical manuscripts, early printed books, and old master drawings and prints. In 1924, just over a decade after Morgan's death, his son transformed the collection into a public institution. The Morgan has continued to acquire rare materials over the century that has followed. The collection consists predominantly of paper-based works, as well as works on parchment and papyrus. Following in the footsteps of the Getty's Drawing on Blue exhibition and catalogue, the Thor Conservation Centre at the Morgan, which consists of paper and book conservators, decided to embark on a survey of works on blue paper across the collection. Reba, our senior paper conservator, has an enormous depth of knowledge when it comes to our old master drawings, and she knew that there was a rich collection of drawings on blue paper. Generating a list of all the works at the Morgan consisting some way of blue paper required the expertise of our cataloguing staff, without whom we could not have so thoroughly interrogated the institutional databases. The outcome was a long spreadsheet, not only of drawings, but of literary manuscripts, letters, book covers, and text blocks, a few examples of which you see here. Altogether, the number of objects containing blue paper in some form was around 1,250 spreadsheet entries, and that's from around 330,000 catalogue records in total at the Morgan. Because a key focus of the Morgan's collection is the process of creation that lies behind works of art and literature, our conservators are always focused on improving their understanding of the material characteristics of the objects in the collection. The relatively recent acquisition of the VSC 8000, a multispectral imaging instrument, has equipped us with a way of more efficiently examining a large number of materials. Armed with a VSC, and a long list of works on blue paper, we hoped that this ambitious survey would give us a more thorough understanding of our institution's collection, as well as allowing us to identify trends in the characteristics and uses of blue paper across time and location. The survey that we created is a very broad stroke survey that needed to be able to collect data about a wide variety of different objects. Our initial interest was in capturing macro patterns, potentially as jumping off points for further investigation. As you can see on the left, we use the Google Survey platform, which allows the surveyor to enter data into a questionnaire and then feeds that data into a spreadsheet. We had lengthy discussions in the lab about the best questions to include in the questionnaire that would result in the data we wanted across the wide range of materials we were looking at. We also refer to the Getty's Drawing on Blue publication as a basis for our methodology for characterizing the properties of the paper under observation. According to our list, we have around 560 drawings identified as being on blue paper. In the interest of fitting our presentation to the topic of this symposium, we've initially concentrated our efforts on surveying our early modern European drawings on blue paper, but this is very much a work in progress. To date, we've surveyed 360 European drawings on blue paper from the 15th to the 19th centuries. We initially selected works that we could retrieve in convenient batches from storage, but at a certain point, knowing we wanted to be able to report some initial findings, we chose to focus our attentions more narrowly on a subset of this collection. Because the Morgan has such a rich collection of Italian drawings, we crunched some numbers to identify the best place to focus. We found that of our almost 4,000 Italian drawings, around 290 are on blue paper. When broken down further into centuries, we saw that the highest number of blue Italian drawings, as well as the greatest proportion, were catalogued as 16th century. So far, we've surveyed 103 of these drawings, or about 73%. As I talk about the preliminary findings of our survey, I'll be mainly looking at this subset of 16th century Italian drawings. Because this is very much a work in progress, we've not had a chance to delve into all the trends and connections that our data might eventually reveal. We've structured the survey findings into 3 themes. In the first, we describe how we surveyed sheet color of the drawings and interpreted our data. Then we turn to sheet formation characteristics, and finally to media used. When we started the survey, we were hoping to develop a more precise way of describing the color of blue papers as we experience them today, acknowledging that they do not necessarily appear as they once would have. Over time, exposure to light and pollutants cause blue papers to fade and become discolored. Current practice at the Morgan has been to catalogue drawings on blue paper as being on blue paper altered to blue-green, for example, to acknowledge the shift in hue over time. On the left of the screen are the options that we included in the survey that the examiner could choose to describe the paper under observation. As you can see, the options included various shades of blue and also allowed for sheets that no longer read as blue at all. If the verso was significantly different to the recto, the survey allowed that information to be recorded. So one hypothesis that we had on starting the survey was that we would find many examples of sheets where the verso was less altered than the recto. In reality, this did not turn out to be the case, although often linings and backings have prevented us from seeing the verso of the sheet. But we did want to share one example of a dramatic difference between recto and verso that revealed itself. This sheet is an 18th century drawing by French artist Jean-Baptiste Audry, which Reber treated prior to its going out on loan. Because of the deteriorated condition of the mount, she elected to do a backing removal, which revealed a verso that looked like this. Although we have no way of knowing if the verso is in its original colour, this is the most dramatic demonstration that we have seen so far of how far a blue paper might shift. Here you can see some drawings on blue paper laid out in our conservation lab. It shows the wide variety of blues that exist even among a small sample of drawings. When laid out like this, you can see which sheets appear greener or browner in comparison with the bluer sheets. This is not, however, the method we first used to determine sheet colour. Working one drawing at a time, we were initially trying to land on a colour description without any reference points. This led to lots of conversations in the lab where someone would point to a drawing and ask the others which colour they thought it was. One person would say blue, another blue-grey, a third blue-green. It felt like a lot of the data we were collecting about sheet colour was quite subjective and perhaps not very helpful. When we laid out the drawings that we had in the lab and decided which one of them seemed to be the bluest, then we had a reference point from which to designate the colours of the other sheets. You'll notice that we've also laid out here some of the samples from the Blue Paper Research Consortium sample book. Because these samples that you can see were made relatively recently from dyed pulp as opposed to blue and white rags, they're more vibrant blue than any of the sheets in the image. We decided to use this situation as an opportunity to explore the possibilities that the reflectance spectrometry function of our VSC might offer. Reflectance spectrometry records the wavelengths reflected by a surface when exposed to energy within the visible light and infrared range. We identified a selection of sheets with visibly different hues to see what reading the VSC would provide. On the left, you see 4 sheets, which we selected to represent a blue-green, a blue-grey, and a bluish brown. When we captured reflectance spectra for these sheets, the VSC plotted each sheet on the CIE color space, which you can see on the right. This point on the chart represents an indigo reference in our spectra library, down towards the blue area. This sheet we designated as the bluest of the drawings we had in the lab at that moment, and it's the closest in the color space to the indigo reference sample. This drawing was our blue-green sheet, plotted further towards the green area. This drawing reads as brownish and is plotted over here nearer to red and orange. And this last grey sample is in a sort of similar spot, but slightly more neutral. What this explorative exercise showed us was that when we described sheet color against a blue reference, as we did with these 4 examples, our perceptions were backed up by the reflectance spectrometer function of the VSC. When you lay the sheets out next to each other, you can see that really no 2 sheets are the same. It's impossible to know how they looked at the beginning of their lives. They would have had differing source materials. They've been exposed to different conditions over the centuries. However, in spite of the variations in color among the subset, the graph that you can see here shows that the vast majority of the sheets that our catalogue identified as being on blue paper are still reading as blue. It would be interesting to see how this data would look if we'd used a standard blue reference from the beginning. And we're still in conversations among ourselves about the utility of describing current sheet color in the catalogue rather than simply blue paper, comma, altered, full stop. A final remark to make about color concerns the source material that the sheets were made from. It was our expectation that 16th century Italian drawings would be on sheets made from a mixture of blue and white rags. We were not expecting, based on the time period, to see evidence of the pulp itself having been dyed in the vat. So far, our expectations have been borne out, as all the 16th century Italian drawings examined so far under magnification have clearly shown a mixture of white and blue fibers, rather than the more homogeneous blue colouring associated with the pulp itself having been dyed with woad or indigo. Because it has been demonstrated that blue paper was often, but not always, of low or rough quality, we were interested in looking for patterns in paper quality among the Morgan's blue papers. In our survey, we laid out characteristics relating to sheet formation that we could select when observing each sheet. With transmitted or raking light, we looked for irregular or cloudy fibre distribution and clumps or knots where the rags were not completely beaten. Under magnification, we looked for evidence of under-processed threads or fibres, as well as other errant materials that made their way into the sheet, such as shives, straw, wood splinters, or metal inclusions. We also recorded any watermarks and, where possible, measured the distance between chain lines. We were often limited in our observations by linings that obscured transmitted light or confused the look-through of sheets. Most of the drawings are hinged, and in most cases we did not unhinge them for the purposes of the survey. It just simply would have taken too long. The following drawings provide some examples of the sheet formation characteristics we observed in the 16th century Italian drawings. We've selected these examples because we were able to image them, but also because they demonstrate a range of different media on sheets of different quality. This is a chalk drawing by Alessandro Castellani. The transmitted light image shows that the pulp distribution is relatively uneven, and both transmitted and raking light show the large and numerous knots or clumps of poorly beaten pulp. You can see the yellow arrow pointing to that. Most noticeable, though, is the very large thread that has somehow made its way into the sheet. Here is an example of a very cloudy sheet. This is a chalk and wash drawing by Vittore Carpaccio. And the transmitted image shows us that the pulp distribution is so uneven that the chain lines are partially obscured. The micrograph on the left shows a clump of blue fiber that has not been broken down and is actually quite visible to the naked eye. On the right is a woody inclusion that looked like a piece of bark. The next example is a pen and ink drawing by Alberto Alberti, showing a somewhat more even pulp distribution than the previous examples. Nevertheless, we can see that there are plenty of knots in the sheet, which can be seen under raking light as bumps in the surface of the paper. These bumps do not appear to have interfered with the artist's ability to control the movement of the pen across the paper, as the application of the media seems to be unaffected by the lumpy surface. This next drawing by Bartolomeo Cesi in chalk is one of the rare examples we have from this period where the sheet exhibits a watermark. This is one indication of a higher quality sheet, and we can see here that the pulp distribution is more even, although the chain lines aren't always clearly defined, and there are plenty of small knots throughout the sheet. The laid lines here are more clearly visible than in previous examples. The last example from our subset is a pen and wash drawing by Gerardo Cibo. The sewing holes on the left edge suggest that this sheet was once part of a sketchbook. The relatively even pulp distribution and almost complete absence of knots point to a higher quality of sheet than those we've looked at so far. What this range of examples shows is nothing that hasn't been documented before, but underscores the idea that a wide range of quality existed among the blue paper that was available to artists in the 16th century. A limitation of our broad survey is that we didn't collect our data in a way that effectively demonstrates these variations within a zoomed-in subset. Of all of the sheets I've just shown present in the data as having the same characteristics, i.e. uneven pulp distribution and knots. If we wanted to do a more focused survey of the drawings, for example, we'd want to build in a way of capturing the degree of these characteristics so the data reveals the variations. Another objective of our survey was to see if any links exist between the use of blue paper and the choice of media. Because using a coloured paper as a support provides a mid-tone that the artist can use as a point of departure, one of our assumptions was that white media would be frequently used as highlights. This is a phenomenon that we've certainly observed across the range of drawings we've looked at so far, extending beyond the 16th century subset that's a focus of today's talk. These images serve as a demonstration of the widespread use of white media for highlights. These are examples of brush-applied white from the 16th and 18th centuries. As an aside, having the VSC has given us an opportunity to confirm media descriptions, such as lead white, by being able to quickly check for fluorescence under UV illumination. This slide shows a range of drawings that employ white chalk for highlights. One drawback of our data collection method for the survey was that we didn't organise information about media in a way that can quickly isolate those specifically with white highlights if we wanted to quantify them, for example. But this is something we could think about for a more focused survey. Here are some examples of the Morgan 16th century Italian chalk drawings on blue paper. Our initial hypothesis was that if blue paper was a rougher quality of sheet, then it would lend itself to media such as chalk and charcoal. We thought that perhaps on the earlier blue papers, the primary media of the drawings would be predominantly chalk. Slightly counter to our expectations, we found that a large proportion of our subset employed ink as their primary media, whether as brush or pen application or both. And this graph shows that when you identify the primary media, broadly speaking, of the Morgan 16th century Italian drawings on blue paper, the number of ink drawings is almost as high as that of chalk. It'd be interesting in a more focused survey to pay attention specifically to the relationship between the degree of knottiness and lumpiness of the sheet and the choice of media and application method. And this is a question that will require a little more drilling into the data. Although we are a way off from completing our survey and interpreting all the data that we collect, this project has already given us at the Morgan a valuable insight into a small proportion of our works on blue paper. As I hope we have demonstrated here today, even among a narrow subset of our drawings on blue paper, there exists a great variety of material characteristics. I'd like to thank the symposium's organising team for giving us the opportunity to reflect on our progress so far. Developing this presentation has prompted fruitful discussions among the conservation team about what we've seen so far and where we might like to concentrate our efforts next. On a personal level, looking at a rich selection of papers from across the centuries exhibiting such a range of characteristics has been invaluable for me as a conservator at the beginning of my career. My colleagues at the Morgan have been very generous with their time and have really used this survey project to its full advantage as a learning experience, sharing their expertise and knowledge with me at every step of the way. I'd also like to thank Layla and everyone at the Moulin du Verger in Angoulême, France, where Becca and I attended the blue paper making workshop in September. There's nothing so effective as hands-on experience to properly understand the myriad flaws one can introduce into a sheet of paper. The workshop and survey project combined have appreciably enhanced my close-looking skills and my ability to think about why any given sheet looks the way it does. Finally, we would be very happy to hear from anyone who has done a survey or is thinking of doing a survey of their collection of blue papers. Please get in touch via any of the emails if you have any questions or experiences to share. I'm now very pleased to hand over to Maya Donnelly, who will tell us about the Art Gallery of Ontario's survey.
Hi, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for that. Let me share here. Here we go. Before beginning, I would like to acknowledge that the Art Gallery of Ontario operates on land that is the territory of the Anishinaabe Mississauga Nation, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee. The Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. As treaty people, we're all part of a treaty relationship based on the recognition of respect, cooperation, partnership, and Indigenous rights. Most people who engage and work with internal collection databases are familiar with the difficulties in searching and describing artworks when using keywords. This is especially true when we think of colored supports. For example, when searching for blue in the museum system at the AGO, the results showed drawings that are on undeniably blue paper, but missed the papers that verge on a different tone, that are greenish or grayish or brownish, or that have faded and no longer present as their original color. In an attempt to standardize these database entries, a project was designed and a submission made to the Samuel H. Kress Foundation for a conservation fellowship so that we could survey, image, and describe all of the works that are, that might be, or used to be on blue paper. The AGO Looking at Blue Paper project aims are the following: to survey European drawings on paper dated 1400 to 1800, the imaging, documentation, and database creation, the standardization of records, and public outreach. A preliminary survey was conducted by physically opening every box and mat that housed European drawings dated 1400 to 1800. Narrowing the survey to this location and time period reflects pre-industrial era papers that were made by hand using rags as the raw material before the advent of wood pulp and paper-making machines like the Fourdrinier, which was patented in 1799. Some researchers are beginning work on post-1800 colored papers, but this does fall outside the scope of our project. With key characteristics noted, the drawings were taken to the Paper Conservation Lab for closer looking. In consultation with the curators, the works were unhinged to allow both recto and verso imaging. After the imaging, they were temporarily rehoused in their mats with mylar corners for the duration of the project. If the works were required for view in the Marvin Gelber Print and Drawing Study Center, they remained accessible for researchers and visitors. After examination in the lab using North Daylight, 44 drawings were selected to form the core of the project. Of those, 28 are Italian, 10 are French, 4 are British, 1 is Czech, and 1 is Dutch, with the earliest dating from the beginning of the 16th century. This survey size proved to be quite ideal for the scope of the project. As the Crest Fellow for the project, one of my tasks was to become familiar with past and current research, as well as guidelines to integrate them into the Looking at Blue Paper project. Other preparations included visiting the Getty's Drawing on Blue exhibition in the spring, attending the 37th Biennial International Paper Historians Congress in Oslo this year, whose theme was paper analysis, and participating in the handmade blue paper workshop at the Munisverdi. All of this builds on my prior professional experience as a papermaker at a studio called Atelier Retail in Montreal, which is a handmade paper studio that works from textile offcuts and plant fibers, making paper with artists and for artists. So this presentation will outline the architecture of the project survey using case studies. We'll also discuss some successes and challenges faced when applying suggested guidelines and to standardized terminology to create a qualitative database and to engage the public. And the project is still very much underway, so further insights may arise and continue for future research. The first consideration for photo documentation was the standardization of lighting, camera, and equipment in the setup. We took guidelines from established photo documentation publications, such as those by the American Institute for Conservation and the Canadian Conservation Institute. And careful notes were taken of the camera and light settings, as well as the angles and distances to the objects being photographed. It was important to keep those variables constant to provide accurate color comparisons. To take the photographs, a DSLR camera was used to capture the 220 images over 4 consecutive days. This slide here shows the suite of images captured for one artwork. Photos were taken with normal light, raking light, and transmitted light, using LEDs at a daylight temperature of 5,600 Kelvin. Post-processing tasks were also applied in a standardized manner and documented, and we used Adobe Camera Raw to process these raw images. An artist's light sheet with a variable color temperature and a printed scale was used to capture the transmitted light images. While there does exist software that can automate the counting of laid lines and measuring distance between chain lines, I used a simple technique using built-in tools. As long as a scale is present in the photo, you can see me selecting the area between 2 chain lines and then dragging that selection over to the scale. And similarly, selecting a 1 centimeter area on the scale and then dragging that over to the transmitted light photo to count the number of laid lines. So the survey size is relatively small. I used a workflow chart using a free online tool called Airtable, which allowed for the efficient handling, location tracking, and completion of each of the photo documentation stages. I was also able to track all of the data points we wanted to capture for each of the artworks, which are then listed in this slide. The information in gray is what was available and pulled from the collection database. And we augmented that with the new data points, which are listed in blue. The AGO has recently acquired a Kioms digital microscope. An average of 3 micrographs per drawing were captured at 50, 100, and 150 magnification. These images documented inclusions, variegation, pigments, and these transmitted light photomicrographs captured fiber structure and color. These allowed us to hypothesize as to the methods used to color the papers under observation, and even inform some preliminary fiber identification. So far, we noticed that 42 out of 44 papers are variegated, and the other 2 are pigmented. In this example, a variegated blue paper fiber sticks out vertically from the sheet, and using the Z-stack function of the digital microscope at 200 times magnification, we can even see the scales on the surface of the wool fibers. Putting together the macro and micro images, this brings the total number of images documenting the drawings to 352. At this point, it would be remiss to neglect mentioning the importance of clear file naming and organization for retrieval and use in the database. We used a dedicated external hard drive to safely house the project images, which allowed us to access them under all circumstances and through all the stages of the project. In the first column here is a folder per work. In the second column, all of the photos for that work. And in the third column, the thumbnail and the metadata. All of this imaging and documentation lends itself to closer looking, which prompts questions and further avenues for investigation. In the next few slides, we'd like to present a few comparisons that speak to apparent color, to color shift, as well as to sheet formation. When I conducted the first step of the survey in the print and drawing vault, I didn't flag the work by Natwal on the left, my mistake. While reviewing the literature, however, I came across an exhibition catalog that described this drawing as being on, quote, faded blue laid paper. So I went back for it and included it in the survey. On the right, we have a figure study by Tintoretto, which first caught my eye because it is mounted on secondary support, which happens to be blue paper, and also due to Tintoretto's notable use of blue paper. When we look at the micrographs, the amount of variegation is quite similar, but the Natwal has an overall tint that leans more towards blue than the Tintoretto does. For our next comparison, we have this green-tinged Bassano with some evidence of what its former color might have resembled. The uneven color shift shows mottled areas of bright blue, as well as this horizontal, slightly askew line that bisects the drawing that is also a brighter blue. The table on the right is certainly one of the brightest blues in all of our survey. When we look closer, the micrographs seem to have a similar distribution of blue fibers, but the Bassano has an overall gray-yellow discoloration. This last duo tells a story about sheet formation. On the left, we have a late 16th, early 17th century Italian drawing by Palma, and on the right, another Tiepolo, this one from 1745. The earlier paper of the Palma is much rougher, it's thicker, more textured, whereas the later sheet is remarkably thin and more even in formation. The difference in the amounts of knots and lentils is also quite obvious. On a final note with these sheets, an attempt was made at finding a matching watermark for the Tiepolo. Many resembling it were found, but none of them that exactly match it. When considering the amount of data we collected, we wanted to improve on the use of a general search field and also provide an alternative to what would have been a very large spreadsheet. We considered using available free web hosting that had minimal upkeep and the potential for reproducibility for other interested institutions. The database needed to be user-friendly, engaging for a wide audience. And very luckily, the Works on Paper conservator, Tessa Thomas, also happens to be a software developer. So she designed and implemented our database using BaseRow. BaseRow is a no-code relational open source database and application builder. So it met all of the criteria needed for the scope of the project. We put user experience at the center of decisions, and the database has been designed to deliver information in an increasing level of detail based on the interest of the user. Researcher and conservator are two user categories that we created. Separating the information between types of users was a method devised to pique the interest of the public, but also provide an option for a level of increased detail, such as that relevant to conservators. Keywords were made into links that guide users to additional information, and a glossary and frequently asked questions page designed to guide the uninitiated will be added to it. It's still very much under development, so the database is being tested and reviewed for feedback by users with a varying level of prior understanding of the topic. And if you have any feedback today, we would be glad to have it too. Resources like the Philadelphia Museum of Art's descriptive terminology for works of art on paper, as well as the Print Council of America's paper sample book, developed a hierarchy of descriptors for media and paper supports. We reviewed catalog entries and online collection databases, which proved to be helpful to show the wide variety of approaches that are being used to describe paper supports. We considered these suggested descriptive guidelines specific to blue paper, recently published by Sauvage and Grison, and we utilized our copy of the Blue Paper Research Consortium sample book made at the Moulins Vergy. Testing these descriptive guidelines on multiple works from our survey allowed the tailoring of the terminology to meet the needs of the AGO collection. The exercise also shed light on the differences between writing descriptions for different purposes. For example, entering information in the front card of a collection database, adding lengthier technical notes provided by conservation, and adapted catalog descriptions and designing label copy. As a point of larger discussion on institutional protocols for label copy and catalog descriptions, most often the bottom line is simplified to blue paper. So we're working with our registrar of collection information and image resources to try and make a link in the record that clearly defines that the work is part of our project, and also inform the users that the works are on blue paper, even though some present as a shifted color. So through trial and error, a format was developed that encompasses elements from each of the guidelines mentioned, while removing those that also seemed redundant for the scope of the project. Taking all of this into account, the established format that we developed for the AGO blue papers is as follows. The color and method, and if it's nearest to one of the samples, mention the sample, the thickness, the texture, the mold type paper, and if it's counted to amount or a secondary support. So an example of that would be a variegated blue nearest to sample 3, medium 2 thickness, moderately textured laid paper, mounted in false margins. The sample book published in 2023 by the Blue Paper Research Consortium presents 22 samples of handmade paper made at the Moulins Vergy. The samples show paper that is variegated with wool fibers and or dyed in the vat with indigo and woad. Reflecting on the style of the Print Council of America's paper sample book, they are a really tangible comparative tool. And to further extend the tonal range of the samples, we removed 1/3 of each of the samples to use in a practical light aging test. We exposed these sections alongside dyed wool samples and blue wool cards to uninterrupted summer sunlight in a south-facing window in Toronto, Canada, in 1-month increments for a total of 3 months. The relative humidity, temperature, and light levels were recorded using 2 portable Hobo data loggers. The light levels ranged from about 15,000 lux on cloudy days and went beyond the maximum possible reading, which is 34,000 lux, and why you see that graph cutting up at the top. While it's not a quantitative experiment, we now have a wider tonal range for comparison with the AGO collection, whose blue papers are consistently lighter than those from the sample book. The exposed samples were then imaged following the same method and scale as for the drawings in our survey. We compiled the images into a digital comparative tool that shows side-by-side micrographs of each increment of the faded samples, and I'm also currently compiling the macro images into a similar tool. We observed that the cellulosic fibers that form the majority of the paper's bulk fades at a quicker rate than the proteinaceous fibers that variegate the paper. Indeed, the dyed wool threads that we exposed to daylight show no discernible color shift to the naked eye. Considering that substantive dyes bind preferentially to proteinaceous fibers, we could conjecture that fading mostly affects the cellulosic fibers. As part of our fading test, we also exposed papers that my colleague Joan Weir made at the Moulins Vergy in 2023. The variegated paper made of retted linen and indigo dyed wool shows fading that is consistent with the look of light bleaching. The blue indigo unsized paper shows little change, but developed a faint splotchy appearance. Researchers, curators, and conservators have successfully brought blue paper into the realm of recent study in art history and in conservation. With this project, we endeavor to bring knowledge and appreciation of blue papers to the AGO public. To do so, a number of strategies have been employed, namely the publicly accessible database. And we hope that by making this database open, more people will be able to access and analyze physical characteristics of historical blue paper, and it will bolster the appreciation, involvement, and study of looking at paper supports. Public programming has also been developed in the form of a study day and a workshop. The morning session of our study day was free and open to all and provided an overview of the qualities, history, and production of blue paper. The afternoon study session focused on conservation-related topics such as descriptive terminology, the results of our daylight exposure test, as well as multispectral imaging. The second day began with a papermaking workshop where participants made their own handmade blue paper using historical methods for coloring, vat dyeing, wool inclusions, pigments, and surface application. To close the event, we engaged in a close looking of a selection of artworks from our blue paper survey using the digital microscope and engaged in discussions taking into account the theoretical and tangible experience gained by the participants. The Marvin Gelber Print and Drawing Study Center hosts an open door event on the first Wednesday of the month, during which visitors can engage with the collection by viewing a curated selection of artworks, as well as request to view prints, drawings, and photographs from the vault. For the November 2024 open door event, we collaborated with the Print and Drawing Center to have the event coincide with our blue paper study day and included the display of a selection of drawings on blue paper from our survey. The volunteer docents during open door were briefed on the project, and more drawings on blue paper were available on request. Other informational tools being discussed internally are status flags, which we hope to be in blue font in TMS. They will inform users on the inclusion of the works in our blue paper survey. Additionally, we will be placing labels in each of the drawings' housing mats, which will be printed on handmade variegated blue paper, which we made during the papermaking workshop. The project is ongoing and concludes at the end of this year. The work that remains to be done relates to data input, updating the TMS records for each of the drawings in the survey. We will be finishing the database and completing our comparative image study to better inform descriptions for each of the works. We will be rehinging all of the drawings into their housing mats, newly minted with their blue paper labels, and sending them back to their long-term storage locations in the vault. Within the gallery, everybody we've collaborated with is really happy with the outreach and excited about learning more on the topic of blue paper. Our recent public programming was attended by curators, by conservators in training, working, and retired, as well as by professors and PhD candidates in art history. We hope that by outlining the development and implementation of our Looking at Blue Paper project, institutions that might want to survey and describe their blue paper collections can be guided by this framework. We also hope to encourage the conservation community to engage in a wider audience in developing close-looking at drawing supports. We would like to thank the Samuel H. Kress Foundation and the Michael and Sonia Kerner Conservation Initiatives Fund for their financial support. Also, special thanks to Dr. Thea Burns for her valued contributions and guidance. Thanks to my team members, Joan Weir and Tessa Thomas, to the symposium organizers, and thank you very much for listening. And it is my turn to invite our next speaker, Charlotte.
Hi. Okay. Hello, and thank you to our hosts for including us in this program of talks on the very interesting topic of blue papers. My presentation very appropriately sits in the work in progress category of this afternoon's talks, as we are very much at the beginning of what we hope will be a broader scope of research into Alan Ramsey's papers, his materials and techniques. And it's the results of our preliminary survey and investigations that I have to share with you today, which actually sits quite well with the two talks that have just been presented. But first, to introduce you, if you're not already familiar, to our main protagonist, Alan Ramsey, his place in art history, and the works in our collection. Alan Ramsey the Younger was born in Edinburgh, named after his father, who was a renowned poet. He began his artistic practice at a young age with this work on the right, 15 or 16, on blue paper, and it depicts his father, which was subsequently used as a front piece for one of his literary publications. Ramsay continued his studies in London before embarking on his first tour of Europe, enrolling at the French Academy in Rome and visiting also the cities of Florence and Naples, where many British residents sat for their portrait. On Ramsay's return to London, he established a successful studio and became internationally renowned for his outstanding portraits, particularly of women. He made a total of 4 trips across Europe in his life, and the impact of European trends are evident in his stylistic development, which is illustrated by these 2 portraits of his first and second wife at different stages in his career. He found a significant patron in the Prince of Wales, later King George III, who appointed him as principal painter in ordinary and was commissioned to paint full-length coronation portraits of the King and Queen Charlotte, of which several copies were produced by Ramsay's studio. These are just 2 examples now in the collection of the Scottish National Gallery. It's worth noting that examples of Ramsay's portraiture can be found in many collections across the UK, but it's at the National Galleries of Scotland that we have the largest holding of works on paper, with 275 drawings, 2 sketchbooks, and 1 permanently framed self-portrait pastel. These works have come into the collection predominantly as the result of 3 major deposits, the first of which being a gift from Lady Murray of Henderland as a memorial to her husband, who was Ramsay's nephew. This deposit also included 250 other works on paper collected by Ramsay by the likes of Van Dyck, Hogarth, Tintoretto, Piazzetta, and it's with this generous gift in 1860 that the Scottish National Gallery's Prints and Drawings collection was founded. So as you can see, it's a substantial holding of an important Scottish artist that is of great significance to our collection. This slide's a bit of a mess, but it's really just to give you a glimpse of the range of works that we're talking about. They span the full breadth of Ramsay's career, and there is a variety of subject matter covered, including compositional figure studies, portraits, details around the placement of hands and the folds in fabric, as well as academic studies and copies after old master paintings. It's from this collection that we can see the important role that drawing played in Ramsay's artistic practice, and it's noted in Alistair Smart's essay in the complete catalogue of Ramsay's paintings that it is his devotion to drawing that sets him apart from his contemporaries. I think it's interesting that not only was drawing a constant in Ramsay's life, but so too was the collecting and compiling of these sketches. Even as he traveled and worked in studios from London, Edinburgh, and Rome, he built up this collection of sketches, which I think in itself is evidence of the importance that he himself placed on the drawings and also on drawing itself. So why are we looking at these works now, and what do we hope to find out? Well, the Scottish National Gallery has recently undergone a major capital project to reposition the Scottish collection, the physical manifestation of that being a new suite of galleries that opened in September of 2023. But further ambitions of the project were to enhance our knowledge of Scottish art and artists. And it is in support of this aim that we are eager to look in more detail at this rich resource and find out what more we can learn about Ramsay, his practices, and his access and use of materials in the mid-18th century. The current scholarly interest in blue papers gave us a starting point, an area in which to focus our first surveys of the collection, and we are pleased to have the opportunity to bring our research to this forum and contribute to these discussions. So according to our catalogue details in our database, 87 of the works on paper are described as being on blue paper. A further 50 are described as being on grey paper, which, as we know, can be a misleading distinction. And as you can see from this list of material descriptions, the terminology varies a great deal and is not applied consistently across the works. First and foremost, this project is an opportunity for us to address those cataloguing discrepancies, review the vocabulary, and use this as an exercise within our team to establish a consistent approach and language for describing papers. We can also take forward examples for technical analysis in order to further understand their material makeup. And these 3 methods listed are what we have access to at NGS, but others may be explored in the future if we want to take the research further. This will really come to the fore when we look at those works in a collection that are a bit more of an anomaly, those that are, for example, described as being on a prepared ground, or as in this case, coated with a wash or varnish. And finally, it's a potential output of this research that we can review the data gathered by the survey and see what trends emerge, which could perhaps inform curatorial discussion. Many of the sketches relate to known finished portraits. However, for many, the identification of the sitter is more speculative, as in this case. Likewise, only half of the drawings are dated, so it's possible, if trends are apparent, we may be able to address some of those blanks or question marks. But for now, I can share with you how we've approached our survey and where we've got up to. Our first step was to get an overview of the works and determine the range and the number of different types of blue paper that we're dealing with before selecting a sample set to bring through the department for a more in-depth investigation. So in order to sort of avoid all those subjective classifications that were talked about earlier, decided to use a method that was more systematic and leave less room for subjectivity. And so we opted to use a spectrophotometer. We have a handheld device, a Konica Minolta CM26D, which, without getting too technical, is an instrument that measures color by reading the light reflected by a material. It produces readings across 3 variables, L, A, and B, which can be expressed on the graph in the top right. As you move across the horizontal A axis, you move between green and red. And as you move up and down the B axis, you go between blue and yellow. And the L scale, which is represented by the bar, the separate bar on the left, this indicates how dark a color is. The software, SpectraMagic NX, can also produce a reflectance spectra across the visible light range of 350 to 750 nanometers. And an example of one is shown there on the lower right. And here I am taking a measurement of an object. The sample area is approximately 5 millimeters in diameter. A sample site is chosen that is representative of the overall paper color, so devoid of any media staining or discoloration. And where access permitted, I also nominated a second test site on the verso as well. I placed a barrier marker board on the object, placed the device on top of that, and pressed the button to take a reading, which is fairly instantaneous. And here are all the results gathered so far, having sampled approximately 110 of the works in the print room. It's not quite the nice, neat groupings I was hoping for, but nevertheless, there are some distinctions that can be made, and I've assigned the following groupings from which to select, to make a selection to bring through a representative set of works into the studio for further analysis and investigation. At this point, it's interesting to note some early observations. All the works in the lower left, 3 categories, so the dark blue, the light blue, and the purple. These are all categorized as blue paper on the database. Things start to go slightly awry in the sort of the light green box, where even the term greenish gray makes an appearance. But I can say it's the box in the middle, the green box in the middle, where things get really confusing. And things can be either classified as blue or gray without much consistency in approach. So in terms of a data set, that's an area where we can focus our efforts in terms of tidying up our terminology. So that's helpful to know. The divide that you can see also becomes interesting when we start to look at the papers in more detail under the microscope and try to understand the manufacturing processes at play, because what I think we're seeing is that the papers that are dyed in the vat all fall into the lower left categories, where obviously there's a more intense blue, and those that are falling in the top half, the upper right section, are the variegated papers where there's clearly blue fibers present, but the overall color and appearance is more subjective and can lean towards either gray or blue. As shown here with the example on the right, that's there's clearly blue fibers present, but it's currently categorized as a gray paper. And here are some examples of the reports generated by the spectrophotometer software. You can see across these 2 examples how the reflectance spectra varies. We've not gathered any reference spectra for comparison yet, but if and when we do get the sample booklet from the Moulin de Verger, the blue sample booklet we're trying to get, we'll have something to reference. But looking at the spectra that is also published in the Getty publication, the work on the left at least appears to be consistent with indigo. However, I think spectral analysis across a wider range of wavelengths would be more informative and conclusive. It is, however, a useful feature of the software and helpful to include in this report, which we can then save as a copy in the object file. So now the works are in the studio, and we're following the method described by Michelle Sullivan, Leila Sauvage, and Marie-Noëlle Grisson in the technical appendix of the Getty publication, using it as a blueprint to set out our own technical reports. And I have one here just to show as an example. The sketch is a study that relates very closely to a known portrait of George III. And it's an example of a very distinctive set of papers from within the collection. It's quite a dark grey-blue. There's about 15 works that are on this particular type, well, similar looking paper. And we're looking closely at the works using visible light sources and a microscope, and then details are then recorded in the table of observation. So for instance, we can see looking at this work that under raking light, the texture and relief of the recto is the wire or mold side of the paper. The transmitted light shows the pulp to be quite cloudy overall and uneven in its distribution, with it being much denser in the top half and quite thin around the lower edges. A watermark is evident just right of center. And from the verso, the pattern of the chain lines appears much more prominent, with dark halo lines running vertically alongside the chain lines. This gives an overall less even overall coloration to the verso and a more mottled effect than what appears on the recto. And when I mentioned that there's 15 other works on this very similar type of paper, it's interesting to note that Ramsay hasn't always been consistent in terms of nominating a recto and a verso, given that there is quite a distinct difference in their visual appearance. In terms of the watermark, we can provide more detail where possible using online databases to do a bit of research. This motif, which I hope you can make out, the fleur-de-lis and the coat of arms, it shows up quite a few times across the collection, and in some cases, including the letters LVG, and a reference can be found in Churchill to Libertus van Gerewink, a Dutch papermaker and manufacturer in the 18th century, associated with several English paper firms, but as we've touched on before, not a solely reliable piece of information, given that the letters were quite often appropriated by paper manufacturers across Northern and Western Europe, from what I understand. Using the microscope at 25, 50, and 100 times magnification, we can see very even homogeneous fiber structure. And while occasional blue fibers can be seen, you can also see that the color is consistent through the matrix itself, and likely therefore to be the result of dye being added to the vat during processing. And just to give you an example of what some of the other papers that we've been looking at, this is just a small selection of the watermarks we have recorded. Again, the Strasbourg coat of arms in the lower left there, and well, I think both the watermarks on the left-hand side are examples of Northern European watermarks, whilst the two examples on the right, the research so far suggests are both possibly Italian, possibly Venetian actually, which in the case of the top right work makes sense, as this is a very well documented work, a portrait of his second wife done in the latter phases of Ramsay's career, when he has given up painting due to injury and is on his third trip to Italy. And in this slide, it shows you the variety of what we've been able to see under the microscope. All these images are at 50 times magnification. The examples on the left showing a mix of blue fibers and dye in the vat, while the examples on the right, where color classification is proving more subjective, seem to be getting most of their color from the variegated fibers alone. I'm curious to know, for those of you working with blue papers and understanding the manufacturing process and production processes, is there a clear divide in terms of Northern and Italian processes? Is adding dye to the vat, for example, a more common practice in Dutch paper making? I'm just curious. It's just a question that's come to mind. In terms of technical analysis and where we've got to with that, firstly, microfading. If you're not familiar, a microfader is an instrument that allows the rapid, non-destructive testing of the relative light sensitivity of an object or an artwork. We use it a lot at NGS as a risk management tool to determine recommended light budgets for works on an individual basis. And so far, we've been able to test 7 of the Ramsey drawings. And what we are finding so far is that although the works are each behaving a little bit differently, which is interesting in itself, on the whole, the results for the papers are all coming out around the same point, which is comparable to Blue Wool 2, or better, as in this case. And that results in a recommended light budget of 2 years per decade, given a 500-year lifespan expectancy. This work seems to be the most interesting so far, as the first paper test site was found to be very sensitive, close to a Blue Wool 1.5. However, when other test sites were chosen, this reading could not be replicated. As this is one of the variegated papers, I do wonder if what we are seeing then is the difficulty in getting consistent reading due to the varied nature of the paper's makeup. But we'll continue to survey the rest of the set and see what else the microfader can show us. We also have a HSI, hyperspectral imaging setup. This is the benchtop model from Clyde HSI. And it's limited to taking scans of a narrow strip of an object. But given that we are just interested in looking at the paper, there is enough information gathered from one pass of the scanner. We've got 2 cameras in the setup, one for the visible near infrared and one for the near infrared range of the light spectrum. We've just started looking at the papers with this and have not really processed or analyzed the data, but this was just to give you an example. This is an example of 4 spectra that have been taken from 4 different drawings. The lower 2 lines of spectra are from the distinctly blue dyed in the VAC type of paper, whilst the upper 2 lines, excuse me, are spectra taken from the variegated papers. As I said, we're yet to interpret or even get reference spectra to compare this to, but this is just to illustrate the direction of our next steps in our investigation. I mentioned earlier that there were a few examples in the collection of drawings that present a different set of material questions, those that are on prepared ground, or as shown here on the right, and those that are described as having a wash or a varnish, as the example on the left. I hope you can see that from this example that there's an overall yellow hue or cast across the sheet. It's quite uneven. I feel that there's signs it's a result of something having been applied with a brush. You might see that there's in the center at the top, there's a sort of a vertical flash of blue. That's quite likely the result of a gap between two vertical brush strokes. My first guess is that it's a form of fixative that's been applied. However, it's unclear at what stage it would have been applied, whether it be by Ramsey's hand himself or at a much later stage. I'd be interested to see if we can confirm the presence of casing, given the known use by artists in this period of milk as a fixative, particularly having read the Morgan Library's work with Gainsborough and what they've been able to find with the liquid chromatography mass spectrometry. But that, again, yeah, is something for the future if we take the material analysis any further. And that's really where we've got up to so far, but some further steps ahead are to bring in our curatorial colleagues to review the data and the trends flagged by the survey and see what more questions this throws up. I'd be keen to go back through our cataloguing history and see what evidence we still have from the initial inventory at the point of deposit, to see if there are any clues or material descriptions that might shed some more light. Also, we have here in Edinburgh, through the National Library and the National Records Office, access to first-hand manuscripts and archives relating to Ramsey, his family history, and his business records. And so there might be references there to his use of materials throughout his travels and career. And so it would be interesting to see how that relates to what we've been seeing in the papers But so far, the research has been really interesting and informative, and a great exercise for our team to look closely at papers. I thank the research teams at the Getty and the University of Amsterdam for their work so far, and their very useful publication, which was relied on a lot, and also to thank members of my team at NGS who have also assisted with the research so far. And with that, I'm going to pass back to Leila and to moderate the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. I will invite as well Maya and Elizabeth. We have a couple of minutes to address. We had many questions. Some might be answered directly by some of you when it's a direct answer. But there was a couple of things that I thought came across through the different talks. There was maybe one question to Maya about how precisely you measured the distance between lead and chain line. And I was wondering whether through collecting these things, do you see any trends? What kind of information do you get from that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel it was very precise considering that, I could select like to the millimeter the distance between the chain lines, and then drag it up to the scale. And I think it would be not as precise if there was a distance, but considering the thickness of the paper is very thin, that shouldn't really be an issue. And there are general trends, definitely. Like most of them fall within the 2.7 to 2.9 centimeter difference. So I feel that based on that and the scholarship that exists on the structure of laid molds, it can give us a pretty good idea of when and where, and like corroborate that kind of information the paper was made.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There's then a question, maybe for Elizabeth. Someone asked whether there is a standardized typology for blue paper or colored paper in general, such as a Munsell chart for soil color.
Not that I'm aware of. I feel like Leila, you might have a better answer for that. But I mean, I guess that was part of the aim of the blue paper sample booklet that your research consortium came up with. But this is part of the kind of problem, and this is something that we thought a lot about when we were thinking about the descriptions and whether or not we wanted to come up with our own set of references, whether that be references that align with the kinds of discoloration and fading that we see, in order to improve our catalog descriptions. And I think we've landed on no, that there's probably not a lot of point to that. But I don't know what anyone else thinks about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think color description, color shift is definitely an issue. And it's interesting to see how Charlotte has a rather objective way of dealing with that, with spectrophotometry measurements. You're dealing with terminology, Elizabeth, and Maya is also trying to use imaging to describe that. So it's a difficult question, which I think we will go back to tomorrow. So there will be more time to talk about that. I have maybe time, let's say, for one more question for Charlotte. The case of Ramsey is a very interesting one because he was traveling all around. Do you know whether there is any, now that you've studied a bit better his corpus, can you get any information about how his location basically impacts the types of blue paper he's choosing? Is there any local versus imported papers? Is there any chronological connections to travel?
Yeah, that's definitely the aim of what we want to one of the big questions we want to ask of this research, is to see that if there's a chronology and to see how his travels influenced his access and use of materials, because there are quite clearly some Italian papers being used which correlate perfectly with the times that he was working in Italy. It gets a bit murkier with the times that he's back in the UK and where he's sourcing his material from when he's working in the UK. But I'm hoping that there might be clues in sort of the first-hand accounts. And there's diaries that not so much his own diaries, but there's diaries from contemporaries of his that wrote about him that I know he's mentioned in. So I'm hoping there might be clues there. But yeah, I don't have answers yet. But that's the big questions that we have.
No, it's very interesting. There was just maybe one question, because I think all of you had to deal with that, maybe less Charlotte because your corpus was more reduced. But when you had to look for blue paper within your catalogs, how easy was that? And yeah, how do you then learn from this process in order to, for example, Maya, you mentioned you missed some of those drawings on blue paper. How can we do better?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like I definitely dove in quite rapidly in terms of just going in physically and opening every box and every mat that fit the time frame and area. But I feel like, yeah, getting a real feel for the artists that typically use blue paper, and like even just in today, some of the names were repeated often. So having that kind of basic information before diving in is quite important. And then also doing it in good lighting is also really something that made a massive difference for me. And I tried to be more careful in terms of like taking everything that might possibly, like I had a possibility and wanted to look closer in good lighting. But yeah, it haunts me a little bit to think of the ones that I might have missed.
No, I think that's a very good point. Unfortunately, we don't have much time for more questions, but we have a round table tomorrow. So we're going to keep the questions for the questions we could not answer live. We're copying them. We are keeping track of them. So we will get back to the ones that are not answered and include them as much as possible in the discussion tomorrow. And all of the speakers who talked today, please, thank you so much for sharing all this very interesting research. We will see you all back tomorrow for the round table. And we start tomorrow for everyone who joined in today with the same link, starting at the same time, no matter the time zone you are in. And we will hear more about blue paper. So thank you all for joining in, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.